Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Sports Tech Allstars podcast. We're running along with our women sports focused series. We're talking about the business of women's sports and how much business there is happening in the world of women's sports. So much investment, so many new innovation hubs, media rights deals, the whole shebang. Amongst those media rights deals and amongst those media content companies is one of the leading ones. And a bunch of girls, guys, however you want to call it, who started around the same time as Sports Tech X did, or similar, I think it was at 2017, 18, where they've shot up. And that's because there's so much happening in women's sports. And who better to tell you that than the co-founder of The Gist, Ellen Hyslop. Welcome to the show, Ellen.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Good to have you. Like I said, we've been kind of tracking a little bit. We have more than just a timeline in common. Of course, one of our first team members was one of your also first team members. Triana has been there for a while.
Yes. She's been there since I want to say 2020.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I think Brianna was with us, I think from 2018 to 2021, somewhere in that period, a couple of years. But yeah, no, great to see the trajectory that you guys have been on. Of course, the newsletter is 1 million+ subs, raise funding. You know, I saw on your socials you've been jet setting all across the US from the Super Bowl to the All-Star weekend. Like if you're doing that kind of stuff, then clearly you're there. You're there in the media game.
Yes, it's been really fun. I think definitely lots of learnings, lots of growth along the way, doing the best that we can at The Gist. For a little bit of context too, on The Gist, we really are the first and only fan-first sports media company that is dedicated to the underserved sports fan. And so we really pride ourselves of thinking about what that person wants and needs, and that person who hasn't necessarily felt like traditional sports media has been for them, so isn't someone to necessarily watch an entire game, watch an entire sports center, doesn't necessarily want to be spoken at by a bunch of men in suits. And so we are really the witty sports, I'm going to rephrase that, sorry. And so we really pride ourselves as being the witty sports obsessed best friend that's keeping our audience in the know of what's going on in sports. All of our content's created by women. Our content is all 50-50, so we cover both men's and women's sports equally, and we really are focusing on that underserved sports fan, which is mostly the female fan. Since we've launched, we've grown to over 1 million newsletter subscribers across North America, which is of course really exciting. I'm growing our social media reach to over 40 million sports fans per month, and we work with brands like Nike, FanDuel, Beats by Dre, Corona, etc. All of these different types of brands who are looking to authentically engage with female fans, as so many of those female fans they're not able to reach with their traditional sports media buys. And so it's been exciting over the years growing our team from the 3 of us to over 20 people now full-time, and a handful of part-time employees too.
Mega stuff. Just to set the context, absolutely right. Thank you so much for that really nicely set up intro. But it is sports content for primarily a female audience, but it is men and women's sports for that audience, right? It's not that there is a bias because there are platforms that cover only women's sports and stuff, but you guys just do the entire sports market, but for a primarily female audience. Is that a fair summation?
Yes, exactly. So when we first launched The Gist and we looked at the market, there was a lot of people that were focused on subject matter first as opposed to audience first. And we kind of looked at that and said, what? At the end of the day, you really should be focusing on your audience, understanding them, knowing their wants and needs, anticipating their future wants and needs. And nobody was really focused on the female fan. And when you look at a female fan, and actually a fan of sports in general, they care about men's sports and they care about women's sports. Women actually do care more and are bigger fans of men's sports than they are women's sports, but they're more likely to become women's sports fans. And then when you think about it from, at least for us, from a true equity perspective, we're never going to achieve equity if there's going to be 2 separate places where sports fans have to go. And if you're signaling to the market one league is better than the other, we truly feel like the way to level the playing field is by saying, yes, you can get your NBA coverage and your WNBA coverage in the exact same place. And we are treating them in very similar ways so that we are creating this ecosystem that is putting female athletes and male athletes on the same pedestal.
I have to ask you the origin story. First of all, was that is just an acronym of any sort?
No.
Which is why I was like fumbling around in my intro and I did a bad job. I was like girls and guys and all that nonsense, but there was nothing around because I don't know for what reason, maybe right at the start, because we were on Sports Tech. I thought it was girls in Sports Tech, but you're obviously not you're not
No,
Sports Tech.
there is a company I think that is women in sports test
Yeah.
called WIST. And so I think maybe some people in the early days got that confused, but no, we're just the gist.
Okay. And you're a bunch of sports fans, clearly, who decided that you didn't have enough content that was speaking to you. It would logically seem, I guess, somewhere around how it came up.
Yes and no. So my co-founders and I, we all met in college. We all studied business. We all moved downtown and we're working in different areas of finance and financial services. And it was really there where we noticed how sports are such a social currency in our society. They have this really unique ability to unite people regardless of age, race, religion, sex, what have you. And at the same time, what we noticed is there were so many women feeling left out of that sports conversation looking in. And so for me, I'm a super avid, massive sports fan. I've always loved sports, always thought that I would get into sports one day. What that meant for me was that I was constantly having to prove my fandom. I was never being invited to the office survivor pool. I had never been invited to participate in a fantasy league before. And that sucked. I felt like I had no community of like-minded people around me, and I always felt like I had to force my way in. Versus my co-founders, they were not avid sports fans. They played competitive sports growing up, but for whatever reason, they really didn't feel connected to sports in whatever way. And when we had this really organic sports conversation and dug in a little bit more deeply with them, it felt like sports really wasn't for them. Sports in the traditional sense have always been communicated in. You have to know all of the background. You have to know all of the acronyms. We assume that you've been staying up and watching all the games and doing that sort of thing. It's really not accessible to new fans and to people who are on the go and consuming media in different ways. And at the time when we founded The Gist in 2017, and even now I'd say there's a lot of focus on linear, there's a lot of focus on traditional channels versus for us in our mid-20s when we started that, we didn't have cable. That's not the way that we were consuming sports. We were consuming news and media and highlights through our phones, but there was no sports companies that were actually serving us through our phones. And so there was this dynamic of women are not being served and this next generation of sports fans are not being served. And so how are we able to fill that gap? And that's really where we came up with flipping the traditional sports business model on its head by developing The Gist.
And that's such an important point because you talk about that's like essentially the evolution of how sports media is being consumed, about finding different audiences and different formats of engagement as well. Maybe a couple of basic questions and around what is the key difference in the language from your perspective? Because I mean, I've seen and I've read content that okay, so that's meant for a female audience and this is meant for a male audience, and I have my perspective on it, but I really want to know for you when you try to get that messaging across, you're telling that same story of yeah, this is what happened, this is the big trade, or this is the big rumor, or this is whatever's happened in the NBA or the NFL or whatever, but I'm speaking to a different type of audience. What is the biggest shift or difference between the messaging and how you're deploying that messaging?
Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of studies on the female sports fan and what really gets them to lean into their fandom and gets them to be engaged in sports. And this really is across men's sports, across women's sports. What they're really looking for is a different type of storytelling that's not just on court, but also off court. They're looking for a little bit more the context, the why, the so what, why should I care? A lot of traditional sports media, again, is speaking to that avid fan, which includes women for sure. But when we founded The Gist, 75% of ESPN's audience was men, and then the other 25%, of course, women, including someone like myself who was a super avid sports fan. Versus we're the exact opposite. We're 75% female fans, the rest male fans. And I think when we look at it, Rowan, it's a little bit more about the everyday sports fan and the everyday person and recognizing that people are busy. They're on the go. They don't have time to watch games. They don't have time to watch Sports Center in the morning. How can we create a one-stop shop for them to get the gist of what they need to know in sports in less than 5 minutes? And how can we actually make it fun for them? And how can we make it approachable to them? And that type of format has resonated a lot with a female audience. And I think it's really no surprise too, when you look at traditional sports media, 86% of sports journalists are men, only 14% are women. And so it's no wonder why the majority of their audience is therefore men. We have 100% female content team and female identifying content team. So it's no wonder that the majority of our content is resonating with women. And so I think that there's really just the nuances of the way that you need to be thinking about your audience and what's happening in their world outside of sports. And I think the sports industry traditionally in media has been like, sports is your life. You're an avid sports fan. You're going to care about it and think about it all day, every day. That's never going to grow the pie in traditional sports media. If you're only talking to avid sports fans and you're relying on parents to bring their kids up to be an avid fan of a team, that doesn't work for Gen Z. That doesn't work for Millennial or Gen Alpha. You need to be thinking about how you can develop. And so we're really thinking about expanding the pie by bringing in all of these more everyday casual sports fans into the conversation. And we cater our messaging and our content to make them feel like the Gist is a place for them.
And the storytelling is the way to do that. I've seen that in numerous examples across the sports industry. I mean, Drive to Survive is
Yes,
almost
great example.
Hacked to death. Death is an example, almost like that is the way about it. But that's what it does. It brings access to that good quality storytelling. Is not for me, who's been a Formula One fan for whatever period of time, but like, hey, anybody in amongst my friends that, hey, actually, no, I like that driver or that bit and that, and suddenly you just connect in your.
It was perfect for me. I thought Formula One was so boring before. I was like, what do you mean? We're watching
Just
people
drive
around in a circle. Like, how is this entertaining? And then I watched Drive to Survive. Now I've gone to a Grand Prix. I watch so many races. I write about F1. I'm tuned in and plugged in on what's happening with all of the racer movement, the new teams, what they're doing with the cars. And that's all because I think, too, right? There's the storytelling, but they broke down the barriers to Formula One. They were like, okay, let us introduce you to all of the drivers. Let us introduce you to the engineering. Let us introduce you to all of the circuits. Let us introduce you to how the point system works. Again, that was never done in traditional sports media. There was just this assumption that you somehow learned when you were a young kid and then you're going to develop from there. And so I think that's been a game changer for us and also clearly a game changer for Netflix and all of the sports that have benefited from those docuseries too.
Two relevant examples I can bring up over here. One you might be aware of about the Kabaddi League in India. Have you heard about the story about how the fastest growing audience for them were housewives sitting at home?
Interesting.
Is because the Pro Kabaddi League, which is this Kabaddi is this sport. It's kind of a 7-on-7 sport in a confined space. And it's a very traditional Indian sport. They were trying to revamp it and bring it onto screens. And the broadcaster, who's now owned by Disney and etc., were a key partner in the sport. And the best way that they found they could reteach an old Indian sport to a new audience is by just telling that story right. And just making sure that they're constantly explaining the rules, what's happening right now, the dynamism of the movement, telling the story behind the athlete, all that. And through all of that, they realized that the kind of afternoon slot when games would be replayed a lot, when like, let's say the traditional downtime when the housewife has a bit of time, she's watching her daily soap. Instead of that, they were watching the Pro Kabaddi League just because they got the storytelling right. And that led to a huge ramp up of the audience. And that resonates really well with what you just said. The other example I want to bring up is what you mentioned about the why behind the women's sports audience. I was watching an interview with the England football team coach, and he made a really interesting point, which he said that when he was talking tactics to the men's teams, men would just do what they were told and then just go on. With the women's teams, he was always addressing the why of what we're doing, whatever it is that we're doing. So just a different way of thinking. You can't communicate in the same way in anything. For content, for education, for explanation, whatever it is, you have to find the right way to speak to that audience. So two great points that you brought up. I just wanted to mention a couple of examples that I'd come across would resonate with those. What is the biggest challenge for you in building this sports media brand that you have now, and how do you grow this? You've already touched upon leaning into the casual fan. Is that just an endless stream now and just more of them? How do you find your way to grow out your brand, right?
It's a good question. There has been so many challenges, so many ups and downs for the Gist over the years. We've learned so much, as I'm sure you have too, in scaling our business, scaling our audience, scaling our team. I think for us, we constantly want to be ensuring that we're reaching our Gisters where they already are and where they're already scrolling. And that over the course of the last 8 years has completely changed in some ways too. We never thought that TikTok would show up. We never thought that we'd be going through a global pandemic. We never thought that social media would be monetizing in all of these new and interesting and different ways. And so the biggest challenge that's ahead of us right now is that next phase of the gist, which is really exciting. I think that we have always had that 1 million subscriber milestone in mind, because we feel like with that threshold, we've developed scale, and we're going to continue to grow that list too, of course. But we've developed enough scale where we can really understand our audience and the gister and really hear from her of what she wants from us next. And so the next kind of phase all comes back to community for us. What that exactly looks like, we don't know for sure. It's kind of becoming a startup almost again. We've got the media channels locked. We've got that business model with media channels now locked in. What are the new channels that we could do? We think about community in a couple of different ways. How can our gisters connect in real life? How can they connect with each other digitally as well? How can they connect with each other within the workplace? Our relationship with our audience right now has really been us one-to-one with them, or us one-to-many with them, but they haven't had that one-to-one relationship with each other. And I think that we're really positioned in a very unique way in order to offer that, because nobody has the audience that we have, or the trust from our audience that we have, where they want to be hanging out with other gisters and they feel really proud to be a gister too. And so that's going to be the next phase and evolution of the gist that hopefully you'll start to see probably closer to Q4 this year.
I really look forward to that. And I think what you've got is like, I mean, a really powerful audience, one that is getting a lot of attention from a lot of quarters. Hey, how do we find that women's audience and how do we communicate? And you guys are obviously streets ahead in getting that language and getting that storytelling right. And let's say even from this perspective, we're talking today is because I mean, of course, I've been a fan for a while, but we're doing a series on the business around women's sports. And I always say that when we're talking about women's sports, it's not just women athletes, we're talking about women audiences as well. So on the field and off the field, because both sides are crucially important. From your perspective, where I mean, you've seen all the investment in women's sports that is coming, mainly that's on the field, let's say, on investing in teams, investing in leagues, all of that. Why do you think there has been such a surge? What is it about the why now? Let's say I'll ask that question. Why now? What is happening from your perspective that is driving all of this investment, all of this change, and the wider acceptance of women's sports?
I think we can agree it's been a long time coming. And I can speak to North America, probably in particular. We're still very much in the infancy of women's sports, especially in North America. The WNBA really tipped off on court in, I think it was 1997. The NWSL fully got its legs in 2013. We were literally just celebrating a decade of the NWSL. The Professional Women's Hockey League truly just started in 2024. The more leagues that have been rooted and have some history are more on the individual sports side. When you look at the WTA or the LPGA is celebrating its 75th year this year, which is so wild and exciting. Where we really started to see the shift in women's sports was the democratization of digital media and of social media in particular. When you look at anything essentially prior to 2016, all media was controlled by media organizations and traditional media organizations who didn't feel like women's sports was going to make them money. Therefore, they didn't invest in it. Therefore, they didn't put it on TV enough. And therefore, there wasn't enough fandom. All of a sudden, a lot of people have autonomy to be able to share and do what they want from their own phones, from their own laptops, their own computers, and share from their own pages. And so the only way that women's leagues, women's teams, and these female athletes could get their story and their game out there was actually not through traditional media, but was through their own channels. And so all of a sudden, all of these female athletes became excellent marketers and excellent influencers overnight. They were able to control their narrative, share their highlights, share their stories, and start to build. And then at the same time, companies like The Gist, companies like Just Women's Sports were able to leverage technology, leverage digital media to fill the gap that traditional sports media wasn't covering, and then force some pressure on traditional sports media and have all of them be like, wait, are you guys onto something? Should we be trying something new? Should we be putting women's sports on TV? And it was really interesting when we first were starting to raise money. It was hard. when we did our 1 million round, we oversubscribed, did it so fast because we had the proof in the pudding. And that's exactly how women's sports were treated. Nobody was betting on their potential. Everyone is betting on their resume. Now women's sports have built their resume, and all of a sudden people are flooding the market. On the men's side, they never had to rely on their resume. They've always been able to rely on their potential. We see this in the corporate world too. Men are promoted based off of potential. Women are promoted based off of their resume and what they've done. And so all of a sudden, digital media allowed people to show what the women's sports game has done, what fandom they were able to drive. And then we started to see changes in college. We started to see the Caitlin Clark effect. We started to see all of this momentum that has been built over decades finally feel like it was reaching an inflection point and starting to see this movement trend in the right direction. So I really do think that it was digital media and technology that changed the game for women's sports.
And just double the market for sports, which is, of course, interesting for any audience, any business. Staying on the theme of technology, what are the big, from your perspective, the big drivers of this change? You just touched on digital media, but within the tech space, we talk a lot about, for example, all the tech that serves women's sports is built for men's sports, right? There hasn't been contextualized enough, just products, shoes, apparel, etc. That needs a big sea change, various other spaces as well. So apart from the digital media aspects that you touched upon, where are the big drivers that you see that, hey, that little bit of input from technology can make a big shift in how women's sports reaches and finds its audiences?
I would say that's a little bit out of my depth, so I'm going to try to take it back to media a little bit. I think at the very base side of things on the tech side, women's games, the way that they used to be aired was horrible. The quality was brutal. And so people didn't want to tune in. All of a sudden, technology and literally just having better cameras made such a big difference for women's sports, period, when it did get put on TV. Women's sports is decades behind on the tech side in comparison to men's sports. You have the NBA thinking about VR and how they're going to include fans from home on those sorts of things. That's not even in the conversation right now from someone like the WNBA, who's driving about a third, not even, of the viewership of WNBA, right? So I think it's a little premature on some of the women's sports sides. What I will say, and where I think the biggest opportunity is in women's sports from a media and technology side of things is on data. And the reason why I say data is because to me that unlocks sports betting. And right now there's really not enough information across the majority of the leagues to be able to create a fantasy product, a head-to-head product, a daily sports betting product that people are tuning into. The only league that's sophisticated enough for that right now is the WNBA. And they really only got their data together, I'd say, in like 2019, 2020. And we saw so many people, especially with Caitlin Clark last year, really starting to sports bet on the WNBA. And when you have the opportunity to gamify sports at all, it really helps to deepen fandom, and it really helps to engage those casual fans who are like, oh yeah, let me just create a bracket or let me create a pick'em, and now all of a sudden I actually am going to watch this game. We are not following women's sports close enough on the data side in order to unlock this whole new market and this whole new monetization ecosystem that on the men's side, of course, in England has been thriving for a very long time, but in North America really just started getting its legs in 2018, I would say. So I'm excited to see how that data kind of unlocks a lot of learnings about that kind of fan experience with sports betting, but also all that data is also going to be so helpful for the coaches, the players, everybody else to make the game that much better. And that's the other thing that I'll say is like the women's sports game as we see it today, and this is going to sound like really crazy to say, is probably the worst that we're going to see it. Because people in my generation growing up, we were quitting sports when it was time to go to college, even though we were really good at it, because we were having the conversation of how are we going to make money? Where are we going to play? The NWSL, I was a competitive soccer player for my entire life. The NWSL was too young for me to think that I had a place to play after school. The only option was to play on the national team. That wasn't enough to be sustainable. Now, all of a sudden, we have all of these young girls who are actually like, I could be making a decent salary from playing my favorite sport. I'm going to keep on doing it and I'm going to keep pushing. So what we see from all of these women's leagues right now truly is just the tip of the iceberg. The play is just going to get better and better because now there's a true opportunity.
That's a great point, because you see that in a number of sports, and you see this. I mean, I mentioned off air when we were starting, we're looking at the Indian market, and this is a big trend that you see there. Like, hey, once it becomes a viable career opportunity, more people are in and more people are interested because they all have a natural passion for it. If they
Yes.
can combine that with a career that they can love, they're probably going to be good at their job as well, which
Mhm.
is to perform on the pitch. So yeah, really, it'll bring new audiences, bring new athletes, which creates new audiences, of course, because even if you don't make it at a great level, you're going to watch it for the rest of your life. All that's good stuff. So yeah, very optimistic about where the market is going. Ellen, we're actually breezed through this episode. We're almost at the half an hour mark, but I have to bring it home and round out with a couple of questions. And this one is actually a personal question, I have to say. What advice would you give a young woman or somebody who's looking to build a career in the sports industry? I say personal because I've got a very young daughter. She's 3 years old, and hopefully by the time she gets to this position, this is not even a conversation about, hey, how does a woman enter the industry? That's what I'm hoping for. But I would love to get your perspective on it for my team, for the various people around me. What would you say is a good way to get into this market? Is it a bit easier now than it has been? I don't know. Your thoughts?
I always have a hard time answering this question because to get into the industry, we founded a company. I didn't come into the industry in a traditional way. I didn't work in the industry, media or sports beforehand. Really, the gist is my first foray into it. And I also think that's probably why we are successful, is because we're building it for real people who are real fans, because we were those real people. When I think about it, when I ask my team about it, I think the biggest thing is to really recognize that who you are in and of itself is a value proposition to the companies that want you there. There it is very pale, stale, and male is what we say. I enter so many rooms where I am the only woman. Enter so many networking events where 85% of the room is male. And when I enter those rooms, instead of being like, oh my gosh, this is brutal, I say, my gosh, these people probably have a lot to learn. They probably have a lot of blind spots that I could help them with. And I think really just reframing your mind, coming in and saying what I have is unique and therefore it's going to be an asset to whatever company you're looking to get into is really important as you start to enter the workforce.
That's a great point, to take like what you might perceive as a disadvantage and make that an asset. And
Mhm.
that perception can very often become your reality. Fantastic. Alan, what's coming up? What does the next year, 12, 18 months look like at the Gist?
Oh my gosh, it's going to be so busy. In the short term, we're really excited to be very soon launching a NAL accelerator with our pals at NBC, focused on female college athletes. So more to come there. We're going to be launching that at some point in Q2. Really great to be working with a partner like NBC. Really great to be promoting female athletes, but also thinking about how their tie into business and what happens after a college professional, or what happens after a college career isn't always a professional career. Only I think it's 1 to 4% of college athletes actually go pro. And so what can career opportunities look like for them if they're wanting to stay in sports? So stay tuned for that really soon. We're also going to be doing some really fun things around the NFL this year. Our Gister's number one sport is the NFL. And so figuring out what we can do there with respect to building a robust fantasy plan is something we're looking forward to. Of course, we already mentioned the community side of things, and community in particular around women's sports is very interesting to us, and providing more service to our audience through women's sports is key. And then I'm sure, same as you, when we're quickly looking at 2026, it's an Olympic year and a FIFA World Cup year. And those are two major tentpoles that we need to be thinking about today in order to execute on those next year. And so we're already having conversations about what 2026 looks like for coverage and events and whatever else it could be for those tentpoles next year.
Busy times indeed, especially in the sports industry. It just feels like there's so much going on all the time. I mean,
Always.
sleeping all the time before, like there was, it just feels like sports is so busy now. It's a great time to be in and around sports. And to your earlier question, yeah, if you want a job, just make it up. Just hopefully somebody, yeah, hopefully you can find an audience. Somebody will pay you enough for it. But I think that's a decent way. I think that was at least that was our strategy as well. So I'm on board. I was on board with that one. No, brilliant, Ellen. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really enjoyed our conversation. Before I let you go, my last question. I think we're firmly established that we're sports fans here. So I want to know, what has been your favorite sporting moment?
Oh my gosh. I had the privilege to go to the Olympics in Paris and saw Simone Biles win the all
Oh,
round
wow.
golds, which was just such a redemptive moment for her. And being in that crowd was fantastic and amazing and just so cool. And I'd never seen a gymnastics event live, let alone an Olympic all round final. And so that was something that I truly will never forget.
Incredible. I mean, I was there at the Olympics and I caught a medal-winning performance as well, but not Simone Biles, not even that close. But I did watch my Indian hockey team win a bronze. It was one of our
Wow.
one of our 4 medals. We didn't have a good turnout at the Olympics this year, nothing to be proud about. But I caught them win one of the few ones. So no, the Olympics were
Very
great. You had
cool.
a good time in Paris, I take it, yeah?
Yeah, it was amazing. Paris was what I expected and even more. We had such a great time going there, so it was really fun.
Well, we expect plenty from you at the Chase. Congratulations once again on the amazing work that you do. I watched a little bit of prep that I was doing, a little video that you guys put out a few weeks or months ago about all the negative comments you got at the start and how nobody's going to believe a newsletter. I think one of the comments was, I'll ask my wife whether she wants this and
Yes.
stuff, all sorts of fun stuff. And look at where you are now.
No,
Amazing
thank
and
you.
long way to go. Best of luck on that journey. Thanks so much for taking
Yeah,
the time.
thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, guys, that's a wrap for another episode. If you have a few more to go, some fantastic people to talk to within the women's sports industry. Like I mentioned, we're covering topics on the pitch and off the field of play as well. So stay tuned for more. See you guys next week. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Tech Allstars podcast with Rohan Malhotra. If you like our show, let us know and leave a review. And if you want to know more about us, check out sportstechx.com, where you can find our latest industry reports and updates. For a deeper dive into all things sports tech, check out our comprehensive database, Sports Tech DB, at sportstechdb.com. Don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us at Sports Tech X on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Join us next time for another insightful conversation with a leader in sports tech.